Hey everybody, and welcome back to the road to Avengers Doomsday, and today's film is X-Men, which, as I mentioned in the last review, basically always sort of gets the unofficial title as the first Marvel movie to really put Marvel on the map, I guess, in terms of their big budget cinematic films, because Blade always got like shoved under the table, I guess, because it was so like niche and it wasn't really like a major like popular character. But X-Men, was X-Men. There was the success of the TV show, the cartoon show. There was obviously the comics itself, which were, I think, probably, if we had to, gauge it, I would assume the X-Men were probably more popular than Blade, simply because of probability statistics, because there's like 100 and something, 200 something X-Men characters, and there's only one Blade. So, I mean, it's night and day. There was a lot to sort of research on this with the production stuff. Again, I wasn't really aware of X-Men when I was a kid. The first movie that I was aware of, we haven't gotten to yet, when Marvel started doing these movies, I actually watched X-Men 1 shortly before X-Men 2 came out, and I hadn't seen it all the way, and I think I saw it on television. I did not see this in the theater, mainly because I wasn't the biggest X-Men fan growing up. I knew the cartoon show existed, and I knew that the X-Men existed because they were cameos in a couple of episodes of Spider-Man. I think there was a couple of episodes where Peter was dealing with his genetic problem, where he was, his powers were messing up, and he was turning into a human man spider. But I think most of the X-Men were in those episodes, and then there was the Battle World episodes towards the end of the series where Storm popped up again, and those are really cool to see them there. I just never really got into the X-Men cartoon show as a kid. I watched it, years later, right before the relaunch of that show came on Disney Plus. But I really didn't know that much about X-Men. But researching this movie, there was a lot of over the years, I've read different things and I've heard different things. I don't know how much is true. From what I've mostly pieced together, I would assume that they were trying to make it a little bit more like the TV show / the comics in certain areas, and obviously the studio kind of fought back on a few things, because again, this is something we're going to see a lot in these early Marvel movies and even into the MCU, is studio pushback involving the more cosmic-y, more, I guess, weird things that exist in the Marvel universe. So I believe some of the writers were attempting to use the Sentinels. They really wanted the Sentinels in the movie, and Fox just basically said no dice, because they didn't believe that audiences would kind of understand that 50-foot killer robots would be hunting down mutants. It's I don't understand why that's a problem. I mean, if you're going to make a movie about a guy who's got metal claws and a guy that shoots laser beams out of his eyes and another guy that controls magnets and metal, I don't know why you're drawing the line at nope, you know what, giant purple killer robots. You gotta, the realism has to end somewhere. The buck has to stop somewhere, and that's where we're going to stop it. So, I mean, they pretty much cut them off from like the alien stuff that the X-Men does, because the X-Men do a lot of stuff in space, with different like empires and stuff that are out in the Marvel universe, not just the Kree and the Skrulls, but there's other races and stuff that they've done. I think the Shari or something, I'm probably butchering that name, but I know there's that and a few other things they do in space. Asteroid M is where Magneto hangs out. I think it's a separate thing, like his Genosha thing where he lives alone. But that was never going to fly. They basically was never going to do any of that stuff. And then I remember reading a couple of different versions of the script where it started with like sort of an origin of every X-Men, like all of the main ones we were going to see in the movie. So like there was an origin showing Cyclops getting his powers as a kid, Jean Grey getting her powers as a little girl, Storm in Africa, freaking everybody out by controlling the weather. But all that stuff, either I don't know if that was real or if that was just what somebody wanted and they wrote it. But I remember reading that somewhere in the internet a long time ago. But it's like X-Men obviously is a bigger challenge than Blade, because not only is it a more visually enhanced film because you have to deal with all the superpowers for everybody that you're going to stick in the movie, it's also just a bigger cast. It's just huge. It's a number of characters that you need to give time and space to, and there's no way in hell you're going to be able to do everybody and do it all justice. So you kind of just got to put a couple names out of a hat and pray that you stick with what you've got. You can't pick everybody. And the characters you focus on are the characters you're just going to have to put as much time and effort into. Now, the trick here was they kind of, I think, wanted to do the thing from the comics, which is the thing we're all very excited about now with Doomsday coming out. We've seen the X-Men are back, and Cyclops is getting a bit of a glorious return in that he's in his costume from the comics, and he looks like he's doing some badass stuff. But Cyclops in the X-Men movies at this time was night and day. And a lot of that had to do, again, with studio pushback, where the studio didn't feel that Cyclops was a good main character for the X-Men films, simply because they felt he was boring, because he's sort of just, the goody-goody who leads the X-Men kind of a deal. But also their big issue was the visor. They didn't think that an audience would kind of emote or like relate to him or feel sympathy for him because you can't see his eyes. And I'm always hearing that in films that, there's decisions being made about why characters are designed a certain way and why they don't do specific things like cover a face, or I don't know why that's a thing that you have to. I don't know why that's a thing that they argue. Harry Potter went through a similar thing where they refused to give Ralph Fiennes red eyes like he has in the book because they felt like you can't detect emotion with a red eye. I don't know how they come to that conclusion. They just do. I understand that with half of his face covered, well, not half of his face, but the eyes all covered, it's hard to see like what he's seeing, I guess, or how his eyes are looking at something. But like, he can still make emotions with his face. He can still speak. He can still talk. There's other ways to do it. And the comics have been doing it for years, obviously. The cartoon show did it for hundreds of episodes, How many episodes was in the X-Men show, So it's like, they clearly didn't have that problem there. So why suddenly the film is drawing a line there? So Cyclops kind of got pushed to the side, and their main focus was, let's do Wolverine, because he's the popular one, he's the badass one. And from a story perspective, he's probably got the most meat that you could farm stuff out of. He's what's the word I'm looking for? He's an asthmatic. No, he's not an asthmatic. He's a amnesiac who doesn't remember his past. He's got a troubled past. He's been alive for decades. You don't know how long he's been alive for. So Wolverine is kind of the focus, and they've kind of tied him in with Rogue, who they've established. Who, by the way, I have to say is, if everyone was expecting the Rogue from the cartoon show to show up here, that isn't what happens. I'm okay with. I know a lot of people over the years have really hated what they did with Rogue in the X-Men movies, because they kind of, like, she's not as flirtatious or as, like, badass as she is in the comics, because they kind of just took away a couple of powers she has, so she can't fly. She still has the ability to, like, take your powers by touching you, but they got rid of the flying and stuff, and so she's not really a total badass, and she's also a lot younger. She's, like, 17, I think, in this movie, and we see her get her powers for the first time in this film, and it freaks her out, and she kind of, puts gloves on, she wears, like, this hood stuff, and obviously no one's wearing the costumes, because this was, early MCU. There's even a joke about the yellow spandex that James Marsden makes, which ironically has been twisted out in the modern era, because now all we want to see is comic accurate costumes. But she's wearing all these layers and gloves, and I'm okay with her not being like a sultry, flirtatious Southern belle. She kind of has the accent going, but they don't really make her flirtatious, like I said. I'm okay with that because, again, she just got her power, so she's afraid to touch anybody. And I find it very funny. There's an old Pete Holmes sketch that he did years ago on his show where it was called X-Men EX. And it was basically where Holmes was Patrick Stewart's Professor X, and he was firing all the X-Men for the dumbest reasons related to their powers. And so with Rogue, he brings up the most logical fact, which is that she's got the ability to basically kill you with touch, and yet she's always looking for a little Southern hospitality kiss on the porch or whatever. And I always found that hysterical, because it's like the one character that shouldn't be touching anybody is the most handsy out of all the X-Men that they've got. So that making her kind of muted I'm okay with that. Like, I thought that was fine. And then, of course, that they're kind of the focus of the movie, really. It's Wolverine and Rogue, because Wolverine kind of has to learn about what the X-Men are and what they're doing. He's been on his own for a while, and Rogue is kind of learning the acceptance thing. And so they're kind of the meat of it. And then Cyclops, Jean, and Storm are kind of just in the back. They really don't do a whole lot. James Marsden basically is here to tell Logan to mess off and stop messing around with Jean. Jean gets a couple of like expository little sciencey shots, so she explains like how Cerebro works and how what happened with Wolverine's adamantium thing and all that stuff. And then Storm basically doesn't talk for like 3/4 of the movie until the end, which is probably a good thing, because this is where Halle Berry was kind of not sure whether to do an accent or not an accent. It's funny because she has like kind of an accent in this one, and then she kind of falls out of it in the next one, but flips flops, and then in the third one she's just Halle Berry. So it's like they gave up. They're like, well, forget it. We don't want to even try to do a dialect from somewhere in Africa. Let's just speak normal. So and they get a little bit of time. And then of course there's your big players like Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, who They had the pedigree before the movie even starts. Stewart was from Star Trek, Next Generation on so many episodes and movies, and McKellen had just done Lord of the Rings, and Lord of the Rings was just about to come out. So by the time Lord of the Rings became like culturally significant, and by the time they did X2 and people went back to look at X-Men 1, I think that was kind of a bump with Ian McKellen. It's like, well, it's Gandalf. We like Gandalf, and he's cool. It's kind of fun to see him play a bad guy. The one thing I will say that I like about the first X-Men movie, it is very grounded. It's different from Blade in that it feels a little bit more realistic. Like, it doesn't feel like Blade feels like we're kind of still in like an alternate universe world of the whole world is run by vampires kind of a thing, and it doesn't feel like we're in reality, versus the X-Men movie, which feels a little more grounded because, there's, actual governments that are trying to stop mutants and deal with them and whatnot. And obviously the obvious answer would be the Sentinels, but we can't do that, so we have to have the Mutant Registration Act thing, which is a fine thing to throw in there right now, but there's not like a big enemy, and so it's just Magneto, and he really doesn't like fight the X-Men, and that's not really what these early X-Men movies are about. It's not really about a big battle or a big CGI festive action or anything. So like you get like little bits of it. So like Wolverine does a fight scene in the beginning, or we'll see him do like something cool with his powers, and then we'll see a quick fight with Sabretooth and Storm and Cyclops, and then the ending, it's just sort of hand-to-hand fights because it's not like a big thing. And then they don't really even fight Magneto, which is kind of a disappointment, but obviously I think they knew they were going to get sequels to this, that they knew this would probably be more successful than... I'm not saying that Blade wasn't successful, but I think they probably knew this was more guaranteed sequels. So you don't want to like have them fight Magneto and have it be a big spectacle in this movie, only to repeat it again in a sequel or build up to it. And so he kind of just sort of sits out at the end. I think it's a very solid start for the X-Men movies. It's, again, kind of hard to put the focus on one character, and you can't really blame them for not, like, because like you can walk away and say, well, Cyclops didn't really do that much, Storm didn't really do that much, but it's not just a one character superhero movie, it's a team superhero movie, so it's really got to be how they all work together in certain spots, and that's I think what really saves X-Men at the end of the day. It's that team dynamic, it's Hugh Jackman being awesome, it's James Marsden, Famke Janssen, all of them being just really good together when they're on screen. And then of course there's like little things like Shawn Ashmore is as Bobby Drake, and you got Pyro, who was recasted anyway in the next movie, and Jubilee was there for 5 seconds, and so was Kitty Pryde, because you can't show everybody, and there just isn't time to do every mutant that they've got, So I like X-Men 1, but I don't remember, like I said, gravitating towards it when I was a kid. I definitely only watched it because of X-Men 2 coming out, and spoiler alert, I found X-Men 2 to be much better than X-Men 1 in a lot of ways, because it did a lot of things better, it focused a little bit more on specific things, versus this, which really just feels like it's the beginning of a story, the beginning of a adventure kind of a thing, because you have to set up the X-Mansion, you have to set up Professor X, you have to set up mutants, you have to set up all this stuff, and there's a lot of build-up and a lot of origin stuff that you have to get through, and then once you kind of get to the fun bits near the end, movie's over, because you can't spend 3 hours here. And then, but the teases for what's next, the X-Men obviously getting ready for this war, Magneto in prison, getting ready to probably escape in the future, and Wolverine learning about his origins and how he became, Wolverine, were all interesting things that they could have done for a sequel, which obviously some of those things were what they did lean into in the sequel. And we'll talk more about that, obviously, when we get there. But I still feel like it's a really solid X-Men film. I don't think there's like anything particularly bad about X-Men 1. I think there's enough here. I think also, unlike Blade, which slowed down the film with like trying to talk about like his personal vendettas and his personal feelings towards being a daywalker, the X-Men have a much more easier time of talking about their kind of struggles, because the persecution and the sort of prejudice that they face is a lot easier to illustrate, I think, and a lot easier to show, things at the beginning, like when Hugh Jackman throws out his clothes for the first time and the guy pulls the gun on him and tells him to get out of the bar, or how they treat them when they learn that they're mutants and stuff. So it's understandable a little bit easier. And I think that's what drew Bryan Singer, the director, to the project, because he really wasn't a big comic book fan. He understood like the underlying stuff, that it's all based on like, prejudice against a sort of minority group, and what they do to basically overcome that. Do they prove that they're evil by attacking humans, or do they show that they're better than that? Also, props for them for saying the Brotherhood of Mutants and not the evil Brotherhood of Mutants, something that even Stan Lee said he made a boo-boo with years ago, because why would Magneto call his group the evil Brotherhood of Mutants if he thinks he's doing the right thing. Didn't quite make sense. He called that out, I think, years after the fact. But the movie did a good job with that. In terms of the visual effects, it's pretty good. Obviously, this was a couple years after Blade. But there's nothing here that's, like, crazy heavy in CGI. Like, there's a few things, like, towards the end when, like, they're fighting on top of the Statue of Liberty. You can tell it's a little heavy on the CGI. But, like, Cyclops' blast, the telekinesis stuff, the Cerebro things, the way it's all set up is done very well. Storm's effects are pretty good because it's all done with, like, practical stuff. I mean, some of the stuff, obviously, like smoke and clouds is fake, but like the wind effects and the lightning and stuff works out pretty well. It isn't the worst thing. I mean, obviously, I probably should mention the Josh Whedon line of when she puts Toad out on the ledge and then says, "Do you know what happens when a Toad gets struck by lightning? The same that happens to everything else." It's one of the most cheesiest lines, I think, in the entire series, honestly. That was a Josh Whedon rewrite thing. I don't know why they let that line stay in. They let it do, but it's become a joke in and of itself. I guess the only thing that was kind of, and this is something we'll talk about, I guess, when we get to the next movie, is that some of the characters that were introduced here, particularly like some of the Brotherhood of Mutant characters, were kind of erased and let go in exchange for less, I guess, because there just isn't time to show everybody, so less is more in a way. And so they pretty much just focus on Rebecca Romijn's Mystique, which is probably the best thing, because she's probably the most interesting out of the three. Sabretooth doesn't really do much. They don't really talk about his relationship with Wolverine, so it doesn't go anywhere. And Toad is just sort of there. So it's like, whatever. But like I said, it's a solid start. You definitely need to check this out. If you're a fan of the cartoon show, the only thing that I forgot about was that this movie didn't have the, I think it was the John... I always forget if it's John Powell or John Ottman. I'm pretty sure it's... Yeah, John Ottman takes over the score in the next movie, and he makes the more traditional X-Men theme that we all know, the dun da 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 dun da 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 da. And in this one, it's not there. It's something else that plays, and it's kind of got the same, like, kind of beat a little bit. It morphs into it in the next one. I think a lot of people were disappointed because they didn't use the cartoon theme, which was, like, iconic. Even back then. But I still feel like Ottman's theme kind of mirrors it a little bit with the beats, kind of, so I'm okay with that. I am hoping that when we finally do get X-Men, like, on screen in Doomsday or in the future movies, we do use the X-Men cartoon show. I know people want that because it's so iconic, but it's also attached to that particular version of the X-Men, and I kind of feel like if they do something else, they should maybe pick something else. But I'm okay if they insert it, like, in little spots, like little riffs and stuff. I'm okay with that. So... but overall, I think you need to check out X-Men. It's a good, solid start to that franchise. Obviously, that franchise is filled with up and downs. And if we're looking at it as a whole, not to spoil everything down the road, this is probably one of the better X-Men movies that we got out of everything in the list. So it's definitely worth a watch. So thank you guys for listening, and I will see you on the next review.